You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel. I'm the president and founder of the California Rock Art Foundation. And what we do is we identify, evaluate, manage, and conserve rock art both in Alta California and in Baja California. We conduct field trips, we have trainings, exercise, we do research, and in every way possible, we try to preserve, protect, and coordinate treasures of Alta and Baja California rock art, of which there are many and diverse. We also work closely with Native Americans and partner with them to recognize and protect sacred sites. So for more info about the fabulous California Rock Art Foundation, you can go to carockart.org. Also, I'm open to give me a call, 805-312-2261. We would welcome sponsorship or underwriting, helping us to defray the costs of our podcasts, and also membership in California Rock Art Foundation. And of course, donations, since we are a 501c3 nonprofit scientific and educational corporation. God bless everyone out there in podcast land.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast. Join us every week for fascinating tales of rock art, adventure, and archaeology. Find our contact info in the show notes and send us your suggestions.
Welcome to episode 70 of your Rock Art Podcast. We are blessed and honored to have Professor John Hoops from the University of Kansas, who's going to be talking about his work in the far Central America and uppermost South America, both from an artifact standpoint and also the indigenous theology and just what some of these animal-human figures might mean. Come along for a wonderful ride. Well, welcome, everybody. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel, and this is your Rock Art Podcast on the Archaeology Podcast Network. And this is episode 70, and we're blessed and honored to have Professor John Hoops, who is going to share his insights, wisdom, and reflections on his career related to both archaeology, anthropology, the study of shamanism, art, and the implications for ritual, ceremony, and the theological world of indigenous people. John, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thanks so much for having me here, Alan.
Oh, well, God bless you for coming on board and bringing your background and prestige. So, John, you just published a couple of books, you were telling me. Tell the listeners a bit about those, would you?
Yes, it was. I don't know whether the analogy of birthing a baby is fair, because I have never done and never will do that. But yes, I just produced two books that were a long time in the making. They took about 7 years from conception to publication. And they've been published by Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. They're being distributed by Harvard University Press. And they really represent labors of love in the area that I specialize in, the Istmo-Colombian area of Southern Central America and Northern South America. The first book is titled Pre-Columbian Art from Central America and Colombia at Dumbarton Oaks. It's the fifth in a series of catalogs of objects that are in the collection at Dumbarton Oaks. And I can talk about that in a little bit. But essentially, the core of the book is photographs and detailed descriptions and interpretations of over 200 pre-Columbian objects that were manufactured in the area between Colombia and Ecuador, the vast majority of them coming Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia. And most of these objects are made out of precious materials, in particular jadeite and gold, as well as alloys of gold. And in addition to the over 200 objects that we describe and illustrate and interpret and kind of place within their cultural context, there are also about 15 thematic essays that cover everything from methods of working jadeite and methods of casting gold to interpretations of particular archaeological contexts in Panama and Colombia and elsewhere. The second book is actually has a very similar title, and I always have to check and see what the titles are to make sure I don't get them confused. But the second one is called Pre-Columbian Central America, Colombia, and Ecuador Towards an Integrated Approach. And it was originally conceived of as part of the first volume, but ultimately we had so much content that we had to split it into two books. together about 1,200 pages in total. And it contains, as I said, 20 thematic essays on the archaeology of the area between, actually, it deals with Honduras all the way down to Ecuador.
And what do those artifacts date to? What are they, the beginning and sort of they work up to the contemporary times or historic period?
Well, they cover a fairly long period of time, approximately 2,000 years. I would say the earliest objects that we have, which are made out of jadeite, date back probably to about 500 BC.
Okay.
The most recent objects, which would be ones made out of gold, are very similar to ones that were reported by Spanish eyewitnesses when they arrived in Costa Rica and Panama. So we know that objects like these were being made and used at the time of the arrival of the Spanish in the early 1500s. So that's about 2,000 years of objects, the earliest being made out of precious stones and the more recent ones made out of gold.
And I guess to the listenership of our podcast, the relationship of those to some of the subject matter that we deal with regularly here is these are often ritual, ceremonial objects that have great import and character and are used by ritualists or religious adepts. Some use the term shamans or priests, etc. Am I correct?
Yes, I think that probably is correct. All of the objects are what we might put into the category of jewelry. They're objects of personal adornment, things that are made either to be worn around the neck or suspended from the ears or perhaps placed around the waist or in a headdress or worn on the chest. All of them are objects that are intended for public display as part of the regalia worn by an important person. And, the term ritual is quite broad. I was just going to say that these persons, it's very difficult to put them into particular categories. They can have political significance. They could have been warriors or they could be shamans.
So there's certainly a range of religious personalities that are part and parcel of these objects. And the objects themselves, as I understand it, and I think we spoke about this very briefly, sometimes depict some of these supramundane beings, part of the religious elements or deities or supernatural beings that would be part of the cosmology. Is that correct to describe this?
That's absolutely true. The vast majority of these objects are decorated with abstract to fairly realistic representations of animals that would have been very important to think as well as to look at, and actually things that are good to think. That's a good anthropological
Yes, no,
phrase.
I like that. Yeah, I've used that before.
So they're semiotically fertile
Yes, I love
representations
it.
that include animals that would have been especially meaningful. And because of that, they give us some insight into what their cosmology might have been.
Fantastic. So I always want to contextualize when I meet someone like you, John, to talk about at least how do your personal journey of how you ended up in this rather esoteric yet endlessly engaging subject. So perhaps you can give us at least a thumbnail picture of how you got to be a professor at the University of Kansas, specializing in this rather remarkable subject matter.
Well, it's interesting that you used the word esoteric, Alan, because I think I was always in pursuit of the esoteric. I was a bit of a nerd when I was in grade school and high school, and for me, reading about archaeology and reading about these exotic and distant and ancient peoples and places, I think it's probably fair to say it was kind of a form of escapism. I was very much into science fiction and fantasy literature. I was also reading quite a lot of early 70s, what we might now refer to as pseudo-archaeology, including Eric von Daniken and Ignatius Donnelly on the Atlantis and all kinds of things. But I was very much in pursuit of the weird, of the exotic, of the unusual. And I found it really kind of wonderful for myself to know about things that nobody else knew anything about. So I tended to pursue those things that seemed to be the weird corners of knowledge that relatively few people went into, just so that I could become nerdy about them.
Yeah, so we major on the minors, correct? We sort of deal with the esoteric, the supernatural, and those areas of of interest.
Well, that's absolutely true. And I read quite a bit on the occult and on the supernatural.
Yep.
I really enjoyed reading a lot about religion. But I knew that I wanted to be an archaeologist even before I applied to college.
Wow.
And I was fortunate enough to go to a place that actually had just created an undergraduate major in archaeology. That was started by Irving Rouse, an archaeologist at Yale University, who created a multidisciplinary major in archaeology because he was persuaded that archaeology was transdisciplinary, which I think many of us have realized, that it drew upon expertise that ranged from anthropology to classics to Near Eastern studies to art history to history. And so my program was very much a multidisciplinary program, and I really enjoyed that quite a lot. In fact, I took lots more archaeology classes than I did anthropology, and then realized when I got to graduate school that I had some catching up to do. So I actually studied more broadly in anthropology in graduate school than I had as an undergrad, which is kind of the reverse of what a lot of people experience.
Gotcha.
But I did my graduate work at Harvard, where I was fortunate to be able to work with some truly inspirational individuals, including Gordon Willey, who was my dissertation advisor. And I had the distinction of being the last of Gordon Willey's dissertation advisees. He had a very long and distinguished career. I'm sure his name is known to most of your listeners.
Oh, yeah.
But it was really pretty remarkable to me that some of his first students included some of my mentors, like Michael Coe, and that he was still teaching on into the 1980s. I finished my PhD in 1987.
Fantastic. So, given that interesting academic journal, where did you jump into, and where was your field work concentrated, and sort of how did you get involved with this particular geographical specialization?
Well, it may sound kind of odd, Alan, but it was kind of an accident.
Join the club. Yeah.
I was very interested in the ancient Mayas in particular, and also very interested in Mesoamerica. And we had the option as undergraduates to either enroll in an accredited archaeological field school or to join an archaeological research project and to complete our fieldwork requirement that way. So I went to my advisor, who at the time was Michael Coe, a specialist in the ancient Mayas and the Olmec and Mesoamerica.
Sure.
And I said to him, I'm really interested in doing fieldwork in Central America, not realizing that for Michael Coe and also for many other Mesoamericanists, when they think of Central America, they don't immediately think about Guatemala and Honduras. They often think about areas farther to the south. And so on that particular day, Michael Coe said, I just got this wonderful package in the mail from an archaeologist in Costa Rica. He's finding some amazing things. Why don't you write to him and see whether he has an opportunity for you? And I really had my heart set on working in the Maya area, but I, for whatever reason, wasn't connecting with the right person. And I wrote to Michael Snarskus, who was an archaeologist, an American archaeologist working in Costa Rica. And he wrote back a wonderful invitation. He said, if you can get an airfare to get down here, I will pay for all of your other expenses.
Wow.
He said, just get here and I'll house you and feed you. And you can work on this project that I have in Costa Rica.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
So I thought that was great.
And that's how you kicked it off. Yeah.
Well, I had no savings at the time. I applied for a... Nothing. I applied for an undergraduate research grant, which gave me $800. And that was my total budget for what wound up being almost 3 months in Costa Rica.
Wow.
I think you could easily spend that in a couple of days in Costa Rica these days. But I lived very much on the cheap, out of a backpack, literally out of a backpack. And it wound up being very much an ethnographic experience as well, because it turned out the archaeological site that we were excavating, the closest that you could get to it with a four-wheel drive vehicle was about 2 kilometers away. So we drove our Land Rover as far as we could and then parked it and then hiked for 2 kilometers into this location where basically there was no electricity, no running water, a ramshackle shack that we slept in. And I was just in heaven. I thought it was the greatest thing. I was out in the middle of nowhere.
Fantastic.
And having someone on, and actually I can admit this now because we're now almost at ubiquitous legality, But one of the greatest things about it is that one of the guys on our work crew was the local cannabis dealer. and this was 1978. And so we would kick back after a day on the dig and, just enjoy the rainfall. That's
wonderful. What an amazing story.
But that was my introduction to archaeological field work.
Well, there you go.
This is great. This is fantastic.
We've laid the groundwork. I think we've used up the first bit of our segment. So in the next one, I think we're going to segue on over and talk about the subject matter of the excavation and the objects and what they might tell us about the nature of the life ways and the theology of the indigenous mind.
That sounds wonderful.
See you on the flip-flop, gang.
Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Register of Professional Archaeologists and the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and check out the link in the show notes.
Welcome back, you Rock Art podcasters. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel with Rock Art episode 70. We've got Professor John Hoops, and he's talking about his adventure and journeys with the central Latin America, the area of far South America and the farthest Central America, archaeological studies relating to some of the ceremonial and ritual artifacts and also the indigenous theology. And with that, we can kick this off. John, how are you?
I'm good, Alan.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about this journey of yours. I saw that and I looked through the syllabus on shamanism, and it was fabulous. Quite a tour de force.
Well, thank you. It's a course that I really enjoy teaching. Of course, shamanism is about magic and magical objects and magical thoughts and magical activities. You sort of have to believe in magic if you want to get into it, but there are different ways to look at it. Of course, as anthropologists, we talk about both emic and etic ways of looking at things. Emic being an insider's view, as one might have from a magical practitioner, and etic being more of an objective outsider's view. And I really try to understand both of those in my pursuit of trying to understand shamans and shamanism. I am not a shaman and never have been. I don't even play one on TV. I've never practiced shamanism myself, nor do I aspire to. But it's something I've come to know and respect, and also to consider to be a useful way of gaining insight into these objects for which we don't have written records. We don't have, unlike as with the Mayas or historical records, we don't have anybody writing about these objects to tell us what they are and how they were used. We really have to come at it from the perspective of archaeology. But also, and I think aficionados of rock art will appreciate this, we really have to stretch ourselves in terms of creative thinking as to what all of the possibilities are in terms of how one goes from human thought processes and human experiences to something that's a material object that you can literally put your hands on and feel and experience, and that communicated that tactile material experience to others.
Absolutely. So tell us a bit about these objects, maybe paint us word pictures, and then give us a sense of some of the challenges that you've dealt with and the discoveries you've made in working with archaeology and trying to perhaps, we call it reconstruct maybe indigenous theology, and both from a contemporary standpoint and going back in time. How's that? That's quite a mouthful, don't you think, John?
Yes, but we tackle these big things every once in a while, and I certainly have thought about them quite a lot in this work that I've been doing on the collections at Dumbarton Oaks, which are basically, this is a program about rock art, and what we're talking about are rocks. They're special rocks, but jadeite is a rock, And this may sound kind of odd to people, but it's also true. Gold is a kind of rock. When it occurs in placer deposits, and it's a mineral, rocks and minerals, but it's a natural object. It's something that people encountered in stream beds. They encountered it in erosional deposits. They were able to pan for it and collect it that way. But we're really talking about rocks and minerals here. And among the things that make jadeite and gold interesting for ancient peoples as well as for us is this quality of shininess. They capture light and reflect it in really interesting ways. And there are lots of things that do that, of course. Shiny surfaces of the water, shiny shells of insects. A whole host of things are very bright, but these are things that are consistently bright and shiny and that reflect the sun and the sunlight. So it really kind of boils down to being interested in shiny rocks and how it was that people looked at them. And this is something that, if you think about it, can help you get into the emic perspective, the minds of the people who are making and utilizing these materials. And that is that humans have the capability increasing the shininess of something. And that sounds like a kind of a basic concept, but I think that was a very big part of what was being done in the working of objects made out of jadeite and the working of objects that were made out of gold. Both of which were very highly valued in Mesoamerica and in this part of the Americas where I work, which I refer to as the Istmo-Colombian area. As you probably know, for the Aztecs, jadeite was the most precious material, much more precious than gold, which the Aztecs themselves referred to as shit of the gods. That was literally how they referred to it. Gold was the excrement of the gods.
Oh, my word. Okay.
But jadeite was what they really most valued and decorated their statues with. But in thinking about polished jadeite and the polishing of stones, I feel like I've gained some insights into how it was that the indigenous people of the Istmo-Colombian area thought. And that was that increasing shininess and increasing smoothness imbued a material object with a greater amount of power, if we want to use a term like mana or something like that. And I think that what they were doing is that they observed natural processes, such as in Costa Rica, for example, you have rivers that flow down from the sides of volcanoes. And if you're familiar with volcanic rocks, they're incredibly coarse and rough. You don't ever want to be walking barefoot across lava. It will cut your feet apart. But when those same lava rocks are tumbled in a high velocity river, they become rolled and they become smooth. Eventually, they'll become almost shiny, depending on how polished they get. And quite frankly, that is the accumulation of the energy of the water and the earth and of motion and of gravity and all of those types of things that are resulting in something that's very smooth. And I think that when people picked up pieces of jadeite and continued to polish and smooth them, they saw themselves as extending this same natural, magical, transformational process, so that a polished jadeite celt, especially if worn as a pendant, was representative of the accumulation of all of these actions, but also displayed this accumulated power, something that had intensified this object over time. And that may have been one of the things that gave jadeite its tremendous value, is that it could take a polish and it could become very, very shiny. And then it retained that because it's such a hard material, has on the Mohs scale between 7 and 8, that you could do a lot of stuff with it and it would still contain that brightness, that shininess. In fact, that's one of the wonderful things about jadeite artifacts is you can bury them in the ground for centuries and they're very bright when you excavate them. They're very smooth. They retain that quality. And of course, gold is that same way. Gold is a non-reactive, relatively non-reactive metal, so it retains its brightness and its shininess over time. And I really think that this is one of those qualities that helps us to understand why these particular materials were so important in the context of cultures in which shamanism and the manipulation of objects and of light and of other types of qualities was so important.
Well, that's fascinating. I hadn't thought about that way of thinking about the manipulation and the sort of development and the technological realm for both gold and jadeite?
Well, one of the among the objects that I'm especially fascinated by, that many of your listeners may be familiar with, are these colossal stone spheres of Costa Rica. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think I do indeed. Yes.
They're huge gabbro boulders that have been shaped into almost perfectly spherical form.
I've seen them. Yes.
They were probably very highly polished when they were complete, and there are about 300 of them or more that are known from Costa Rica. And I was part of a UNESCO team that evaluated sites with stone spheres, and in 2014 they actually were listed on the UNESCO World Heritage site. You know, we spent a lot of time talking about these spheres, and I realized that a polished sphere is almost like the most logical outcome that one could have from continuously shaping and polishing a hard stone. You ultimately arrive at a polished sphere. And I sort of realized that there was a continuity between the polished jadeite celts and the polished stone spheres, that they represented this long, long tradition of working and polishing shiny stones. And then, of course, gold objects, which are shiny and reflective, are an extension of that. So we can really think about all of these things in a very similar category. Yes, they have very different qualities, but this quality of being able to be polished and to retain the
luminescence,
sort of the cultural residue of that polishing, that essence of that polishing, is one of the things that makes them such amazing objects, which we, not even being in that culture, can look at today and be impressed by.
We appreciate their aesthetically pleasing. And as you're probing the sort of the theological meaning of these, I'm beginning to get a sense of sort of this capture of power, but this capture of light and this tremendous effort at sort of producing something that's aesthetically pleasing, but also engaged in some sort of a tremendous religiosity, but also powerfulness. Almost like, when we think about water moving and how it, as you were saying, how it rounds and scours and flutes. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, well, but something else to think about. I mean, and yes, the water does that, and it's possible to observe that, especially season after season. But something else that is part of a native perspective is that the repetition of something intensifies it. For example, if you're listening to drumming, the more drumming happens, a drum session can go in some cases for hours. The more repetitive activity that takes place, the greater the amount of accumulated power that has occurred. The more often a chant is repeated, or the more often that dance steps are taken. This notion of repetition being equivalent to intensification is something that can be captured in a material object when what's repetitive is the shaping and the polishing of something, so that you see that accumulation, that literally accumulation of energy in the object from that repeated activity. And for me, one of the best analogies for this is the chanting of a mantra by a Buddhist monk. Mm-hmm. You know, the mullah, or the sometimes referred to as a rosary,
right,
which has 108 beads on it for the repetition of a mantra like Om Mani Padme Hum. Mm-hmm. And then doing that, the more you do that, and actually these mullahs have counters on them. So you do it 108 times, and you count, okay, that's one cycle. You do it again, and then soon you have 108 cycles of 108 mantras. And the more you have chanted this mantra, the more you've said it over and over again, the more that power of meditation has increased in merit. And I think that might be an analogy to what's going on in terms of working and polishing these stones. And of course, the same type of working and polishing and shaping happens in the realm of rock art as well. Now,
absolutely.
I don't know whether rock art specialists would look at these colossal stone spheres as rock art, yes. But it's sort of what happens when every inch of the surface of a boulder has been smoothed and shaped into completion.
No, it's fascinating. It makes me think about a lot of the rock art I've seen, the ancient rock art and the more recent rock art as well, that has been repecked or incised very heavily. And the repetition of that incising, or that almost it gets a sculptural kind of a sense, and you'll see that. And it is reinaugurating the power, but it's also working the stone, and in that repetition, in that effort, in that rounding or grinding away, producing something that is analogous to the kind of etiology, the kind of theology that you're alluding to, and the metaphor embedded in the action, correct?
Well, and in our own culture, think about the power of visiting a medieval cathedral,
Okay.
where you can see, when you look down the middle of those marble steps that lead up to the sanctuary, that they have been worn and are scalloped from the footsteps of thousands and thousands and thousands of visitors. That's the kind of accumulation that I'm talking about. When you look at that and you say, "Oh man, somebody didn't polish these steps to make those scallops. Those are from people walking over and over and over and over and over and over again." And I think that Native people perceived that and revered that.
I think they do. If you go to a particular canyon, been studying, it's a public canyon, it's called Little Petroglyph Canyon in the Coso Range. There is thousands and thousands of images in about a mile period. And it's in a conduit, it's in a canyon, so it's hidden. And that kind of replication, that kind of activity, concentrated activity in one particular area, I would think creates this power, this theological vortex or nexus that we're talking about, doesn't it?
I think it very much does. And I think sacred places are recognized for having that quality.
Well, I think we'll stop here and talk about some of those theological issues in the final segment. Thanks, gang. See you on the flip-flop. Okay, gang, it's Dr. Alan Garfinkel here, and we're honored and blessed to have John Hoops, professor, University of Kansas, talking about his experience and expertise in all things related to the far Latin America and South American realm, both the archaeology, the ethnography, the remarkable realm of theology. And I think in this final segment, we're going to do a bit of talking about the repertoire of animals that appear in both the artifacts themselves and in the consciousness of the theological metaphors for this culture. John, shall we kick it off? And I'm honored to have you on board. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. It's so nice to be talking about these things, Alan. So thank you so much for giving me a context to do that. The issue of the animals, actually, one of the first things I need to say is that we are animals. So we're going to be talking about not only humans, but also non-human animals. That's sometimes cumbersome to say. But I think within the worldview and cosmology of indigenous peoples, it's important to recognize that humanness, personhood, is something that's viewed in a different way, so that personhood is extended to persons with wings, persons with fins, persons with 2 legs, and persons with 4 legs. And so this distinction between humans and animals that we fall into so neatly in our Western theology is not something that was shared by indigenous peoples of the Americas. And I think that probably one of the reasons it wasn't was simply because domesticated animals, sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, and the like, were so much a part of the daily life of people of the ancient Middle East and Europe. But there were relatively few domesticated animals in the Americas. And so the concept of herd animals or beasts of burden or those types of things, that's a European introduction. And that, I think, is important to keep in mind when approaching questions of sort of theology, which, of course, is about deities and divinity, and the recognition of the identities of personhood and non-human animals in the natural world. Of the objects that we've been talking about, the jadeite and gold objects from the Istmo-Colombian area, which is this area between Honduras and northern Colombia, sort of sits between Mesoamerica and South America and intersects simultaneously with Mesoamerica, the Antilles, Amazonia, and the Andes. So I tend to like to think of it as the center of the Americas that's really touching on all of these other places, is the way that people found particular animals good to think. And among the earliest representations that we have are those of birds. And representations of birds are ubiquitous, from the jadeite objects all the way up to gold objects. And in fact, the Spanish remarked on what they called aguilas, or eagles, that were gold eagles that were worn by the leaders the indigenous leaders that they encountered. This was a 2,000-year tradition of decorating oneself with images of birds. Well, why are birds so important? Why are birds so critical? Well, I think part of it is recognizing that powerful individuals, shamans in particular, if you want to use that term, although we can unpack that a bit, but individuals who had magical abilities could also be birds, and they could fly in the air, they could perch in a tree. And part of this cosmology, interestingly, has to do with control and has to do with knowledge. And one of the things that birds are in the natural world, and especially in places like Central America and Northern South America, they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. There's always a bird that you can see someplace. And we have an expression in English that we use where somebody knows something and you don't know how they found it out. And they say, well, a little bird told me. Well, I think something similar was happening in indigenous practices, in that the shaman might know something that he wasn't supposed to know, or she wasn't supposed to know. And you sort of wonder, how did they know that? How did they find out that information? Well, a very simple explanation is that they were transformed into a bird, and they saw it happen because they were sitting in the tree or flying overhead. How did you know that? Oh, do you remember that eagle that was in the sky? Oh, yeah. Well, that was me. I was watching you. And the idea of birds being associated with surveillance and with knowledge may be one of the reasons why they're selected early on as symbols of those people who are all-seeing, all-knowing, or at least have deeper insight and deeper knowledge than other people do.
How did the indigenous people recognize birds and think about birds? Were they particular supramundane beings? Was there associated qualities about only certain birds that were depicted?
Absolutely. There were very particular birds that they tended to focus on because of what their qualities were. Among the most important birds was the harpy eagle, which was the principal alpha predator of the sky. Harpy eagles are large enough to carry off monkeys. I don't think they could carry off a small child, although people sometimes worry about that. But they are very, very, very devastating predators with huge talons and sharp beaks, and they can be quite dangerous. Another category of birds that they frequently represented were vultures, which are associated with the transition from life into death because, of course, they can detect death. They smell death. They go after dead things, and then they eat them. And a vulture disposes of carrion and disposes of the dead. So vultures were a very important bird. Another important bird was the toucan, which has a very long beak, and people often associate, toucans with toucan Sam and breakfast cereal and things like that. But the reality is that toucans are very aggressive birds,
Wow.
And they're predatorial birds. They will destroy the nests of other birds, and they will attack the young and eat the young of other birds. They're carnivorous birds. Toucans are not really very nice birds, but they're beautiful, and they're also something you can spot very easily because of their bright yellow-colored beaks. And then another category of birds that was often represented are these kind of magical little tiny birds, are hummingbirds. And there's a huge variety of hummingbirds in the Isthmo-Colombian area. And, you don't have to watch a hummingbird for very long to realize just how magical that creature is. There's a reason why Aztecs picked Huitzilopochtli as this hummingbird deity. But I would say those are probably the most important and most frequently represented birds would be the harpy eagle, the vulture, the toucan, and the hummingbird.
So those birds make a lot of sense to me in terms of being predators and also involved with sort of a life-death experience, as well as being, some of the most magical or supernatural or exotic of the bird kingdom. What other animals are part and parcel of that repertoire?
Well, I would say after birds, the other important category is reptiles, and in particular, iguanas, crocodiles, and caimans, who are, just as the harpy eagle is the alpha predator of the air, the crocodile is the alpha predator of brackish and freshwater places. Now, yet another important predator is the shark, and there are representations of sharks, but that's a saltwater predator. But the inshore and most commonly encountered predators were the ones of lakes and deltas and coastlines, and those included the crocodile. So crocodiles were very fearsome, very powerful animals, and of course grow to enormous sizes. And so those are also ones that we find represented more often actually we have some examples of crocodiles in jade work. We also have examples of crocodiles in gold work.
Fascinating.
Another dimension to both of these, Alan, which I think merits some attention, is the fact that we also find what I refer to as therianthropic beings, that is, beings that are part animal, part human, that will have a bird's head and a human body, or that will have a crocodile head and a human body. And this is a way of visually representing the fact that humans can transform into these creatures. And, there are stories that abound in Amazonia and Central America alike, where the person who's the shaman or the sorcerer is found to have been wounded. And someone invariably comes up with the story, well, yes, I shot a jaguar last night. And the shaman or sorcerer will say, that was me. Or someone will identify it as that being him. That the idea that humans can transform into non-human animals and move in the forest or swim in the water or fly in the air or do these other types of things, they were sort of like the indigenous superheroes of the ancient world.
Now, within the oral traditions, the sacred narratives, I don't like to use the term mythology, but those types of stories that try to characterize the theological realm, the cosmology of the people, are there these animal-human, supramundane persons?
Sometimes. We have stories of women being impregnated by snakes and giving birth to snakes. We have stories of shamans transforming into jaguars, or sometimes we have stories of parts of shamans being transformed into jaguars. There's a very famous or very well-known Bribri story that comes from Costa Rica about a shaman who was killed, and the people who killed him took his head and were carrying it home with them when the head begins biting people. And then to keep it from biting people, they sort of put it in a safe place, and at night it turns into a huge jaguar, then breaks out of its enclosure and eats people. So yes, there are stories that refer to this therianthropic transformation, and I like to point out that they have parallels in Western stories as well. Dracula can turn into a bat. The werewolf is a man who turns into a wolf. These ideas about humans turning into animals is something that we still, and I talk about superhero, think about Spider-Man, think about Batman. Yeah. This idea of humans with animal qualities, non-human animal qualities, is something that still persists in our own stories today.
It does, doesn't it? And it seems to capture the imagination of quite a plethora of viewers and others. And certainly the magical realm, as you keep alluding to, the wizardry and the shamanism is something that you've talked about. And I guess bringing us full circle, you were mentioning that even in contemporary culture, there is a fascination, if not an obsession, with this kind of dealing. Maybe you can allude to that to some extent.
Yes, I think it's very much a part of our contemporary culture. These are not things that were done only by indigenous people. There has been a tremendous fascination in magic and in shamanism and in healing. And these are things that I found especially intriguing, in part through some of my own personal experiences and research, including visits to the Burning Man Festival in the early 2000s, where in fact there's a lot of contemporary shamanism that takes place in terms of ecstatic dance, the use of psychotropic substances, the creation of ritual spaces in which unusual things can occur and unusual connections are made, resulting in tremendous insight and creativity. And so I think that shamanism is still very much with us. And I think anyone who likes to have little magical objects, whether they be kaleidoscopes or crystals or whatever, will be able to relate to the fact that these objects that were being made by ancient people probably were being used in fashions that are similar, not the same, but quite similar to the way that we use objects in order to manipulate our own experiences into ones that are departing from what our normal everyday experiences are. That seeking of a magical experience, whether through objects or through ecstatic dance or through chants or trance or the use of psychotropic substances, are very much a part of this pursuit of something that is more than what our normal everyday existence is.
And it seems as though the interface between science and religion are becoming more and more of an interconnected thread, and especially when it comes to the medicinal side, understanding of the use of shamanism and psychotropic substances to heal and alter someone's physiology and health has been found to be quite a remarkable platform, or, a medicinal realm. And this is becoming more and more accepted by the medical profession. I'm sure you found something along those lines as well.
Yes, of course. And I think it's also something that resonates quite well with the whole theme of rock art, which is the context in which we're discussing all of this.
Definitely.
Is that rock art, whether it appears in caves or whether it appears in special places on large boulders, in waterfalls or in deserts or wherever, is created for the purpose of generating this non-normal sense of awe, this sense of the presence of something unusual that's inspiring. Or this contact with the ancient, this contact with something primordial, this contact with the people who were here hundreds or thousands of years ago is all a part of, I think, how some of this rock art is created in the first place. And something that we haven't talked about that I really would like to encourage your listeners to pursue further is that there's an enormous amount of rock art in the Istmo-Colombian area, in Costa Rica, in Panama, in Colombia. And it really deserves much more attention than it's received, especially because we can contextualize it now within a much deeper understanding of the cultures that would have made and used it.
Well, thank you so much. We've run out of time, but we've just scratched the surface if you use a rock art analogy. And John, you've been an incredible resource, and your reflections have resonated with me at various levels. So I hope we can have you on again and we can continue this discussion further. Well, that's about it for today. Thank you. See you next week, all you rock art podcasters. See you on the flip-flop.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. Find show notes and contact information at www.archpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.